Welcome, my friend, to the warmth of Baker Street Ember. Settle in by the fire.
As we prepare for tonight's tale, I must ask, from which shadowy corner of the world are you listening? If you find comfort here, please subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Now,
Clockford was the sort of place where time seemed to stand still, with its ancient church tower chiming the hours over thatched roofs and winding lanes, where villagers marked their days by the steady tick of mantle clocks and the slow turn of seasons in the hedgerows, where secrets were kept like heirloom pocket watches, polished and hidden away. Then, on a misty October morning in 1962, Elias Thorne was found dead beside his workbench, a delicate gold chain clutched in his rigid fingers. The watchmaker's tools lay scattered, and his own prized chronometer had stopped at precisely 3 o'clock. Though dawn had barely broken, the local constable called it a tragic heart failure from overwork, but the faint scent of bitter almonds on his lips suggested a darker truth. No one wished to believe that murder had come to their timeless village. Miss Marple had arrived to visit her old friend Lady Hartwell, and like a hidden spring in a watch, the truth would uncoil inevitably. Chapter 1. The Ticking Silence. Miss Jane Marple stepped down from the train at Clockford Station, her small suitcase in one gloved hand, and her knitting bag over her arm. The autumn air bit sharply with frost, turning her breath into delicate white clouds as she tightened her woolen scarf. Lady Hartwell's chauffeur, Jenkins, waited with the old Bentley. Its leather seats felt worn smooth under her touch as he helped her inside. The drive to the manor wound through damp lanes, where the smell of wet earth mixed with faint coal smoke drifting from cottage chimneys. Lady Hartwell welcomed her warmly in the drawing room. A fire crackled in the grate, its heat welcome against the morning chill. The room carried the comforting sense of beeswax furniture polish and lavender sachets hidden among the cushions. They drank hot tea, its steam rising warmly, though Miss Marple detected a bitter edge, perhaps from oversteeped leaves. Lady Hartwell spoke in her measured upper-class tone. "One hesitates to trouble you with village trifles, Jane, but our watchmaker, Elias Thorne, has not been well." A knock sounded on the heavy oak door, followed by its familiar creak. Reverend Blackwell entered with hurried footsteps across the polished floor. His cassock brushed the scratchy rug, and pipe tobacco clung to his sleeves. "Lady Hartwell, forgive me," he declared confidently. "Mr. Thorne has been found dead in his shop this very morning." Silence fell, broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Miss Marple set her teacup down carefully, the china still warm against her fingers. She noticed the vicar's flushed cheeks and the slight tremble in his hands as he held his prayer book. Lady Hartwell gasped, pressing a hand to her pearl necklace, smooth against her skin. "Dead? But he mended my brooch watch only yesterday." The vicar explained that young apprentice Tom Wilkins had discovered the body slumped over the workbench, tools scattered everywhere. They hurried to the village square. The watchmaker's shop stood quietly between the post office and bakery, the air outside scented with fresh bread. Inside, Sergeant Hale kept watch, his boots scraping the cold stone floor. The small stove had died to gray ash, leaving the room icy, with frost patterning the windows. Thorne lay covered, but Miss Marple caught the oily scent of watch parts mixed with a faint metallic tang of fear, and something sharper, like bitter almonds. Tom Wilkins, the working-class apprentice with grease-stained hands, stammered his story. "I seen him last night, miss. He were working late on Colonel Ashby's pocket watch. Looked right poorly." "He did." Mrs. Ashby, elegant and upper class, protested from the doorway. "My husband had no serious quarrel with him." Though the watch was delayed, she smoothed her silk gloves, sleek and cool. Miss Eliza Thorne, the victim's nervous sister, spoke softly from the stairs. "I took him supper at 8. He seemed distracted. I didn't. That is, he was alive when I went up." Stale tea leaf scented the untouched cup on the bench. Dr. Mortimer arrived, bag thumping on the counter. He declared it a heart attack, but Miss Marple noted the bitter almond smell on the body and the watch frozen at 3 o'clock, long before dawn. She noticed the glove, dark brown kid leather, man size, with an oval patch worn smooth on the inner thumb and forefinger, the sort of wear from gripping tiny tools or a watch winder over years. It spoke of precision, not rough labor. It reminded her of Mr. Pettigrew in St. Mary Mead, whose gloves showed the same pattern from forging antique clocks. When the jeweler was robbed, those gloves proved his guilt. The wear matched tool marks on the safe. The innocent apprentice had blistered hands from honest toil. So whose glove lay hidden beneath Thorne's workbench? Evening came. Miss Marple retired to her room at the manor. Wind howling outside the windows. The fire crackled softly as she reflected. Lady Hartwell brought sherry, its sweet warmth easing the chalk-dry tension in her mouth. Suspect alibis floated in her mind. Tom at the pub, Mrs. Ashby at home, Eliza upstairs, Dr. Mortimer on a call. The stopped watch nagged at her. Tampered with. Perhaps, to hide the true hour of death. She sat knitting, wool scratchy between her fingers. The smell of roasting meat drifted from the kitchen, blending with cold smoke. A mantel clock ticked steadily, echoing the silent one in the dead man's shop. What secret had the watchmaker guarded so dearly that it cost him his life? Chapter 2. Winding Threads. Miss Marple rose early the next morning and set out on foot through Clockford's quiet lanes. The gravel paths crunched crisply under her sensible shoes. A light mist still hung in the air, carrying the damp wool scent of her coat and the distant cold smoke from waking hearts. She stopped first at the bakery, where warm waves of freshly baked scones greeted her through the open door. Mr. Croft, the baker, wiped flour from his hands and spoke in a middle-class murmur. I'm afraid I didn't know Mr. Thorne terribly well, but he was always particular about his timepieces, never late with a repair. She purchased 2 scones wrapped in paper, their warmth pleasant against her gloved palms, then continued to the post office. The wooden counter felt smooth and slightly sticky from years of handling parcels. Mrs. Finley, the postmistress, was brisk and working class in manner. I seen him yesterday afternoon, miss, she snapped while stamping letters. He posted a thick envelope, hands shaking like leaves. Looked proper, agitated. He did. A wall clock ticked loudly above them, and a cold draft slipped under the door, bringing the smell of rain-soaked earth. From there, Miss Marple made her way to Ashby Manor. The drawing room fire crackled cheerfully, though the high-ceilinged space still held a morning chill that made breath faintly visible. Colonel Ashby sat upright in a leather armchair, its surface worn smooth from long use. He demanded in his confident, upper-class voice, I tell you plainly, Miss Marple, that pocket watch was a family heirloom. Thorne kept delaying the repair. Said the balance spring was faulty. Mrs. Ashby entered quietly, her silk dress rustling. She offered tea, its bitter edge lingering on Miss Marple's tongue after the first sip. They spoke of the gold chronometer now held by the police. The colonel insisted the last meeting had been civil. Outside, wind moaned through the bare trees, and Miss Marple felt the icy promise of more rain on her cheeks as she left. She next found Tom Wilkins at the village pub, where pipe tobacco smoke hung thick in the low-beamed room. The wooden floorboards creaked under every step. Tom twisted his cap and ruff, grease-stained hands, and stammered nervously. I fixed that spring myself the day before, miss. Master Thorne were pleased. Gave me time off, but I might have gone back later to check something. Miss Marple touched the rough stone wall near the fireplace. Its chill seeped through her glove. Tom admitted a small grudge. Thorne had once threatened to dismiss him for dropping a delicate escapement. The fire popped and sent sparks upward. She thanked him and walked on to the watchmaker's shop, where Eliza Thorne received her in the upstairs parlor. Lavender sachets scented the close air. Eliza's voice trembled. My brother kept his ledgers very private. I believe he had difficulties with money. The small clock on the mantel ticked with a steady, almost accusing rhythm. Miss Marple felt the scratchy horsehair stuffing of the old sofa beneath her. Dr. Mortimer appeared unexpectedly at the door, medical bag thumping against the table. He retorted with professional assurance. Thorne had a weak heart. I warned him repeatedly. No question of foul play from my surgery. Yet Miss Marple caught the quick, metallic note of unease beneath his words. While the doctor spoke with Eliza downstairs, Miss Marple remained in the parlor and noticed a drawer in the workbench that refused to close fully. She eased it open. The rough wooden edges caught on her glove. Inside a hidden compartment lay a small packet of yellowed letters tied with string. The paper crackled like dry autumn leaves as she unfolded one. They revealed a secret. Elias Thorne had learned, years earlier, that young Tom Wilkins was his own illegitimate son. but he had never told the boy. Only recorded payments and promises in code. The room felt suddenly colder. Her breath misted briefly. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Sergeant Hale arriving. He shared new information in a low voice. A small vial of prussic acid had gone missing from Dr. Mortimer's dispensary 2 weeks earlier. Miss Marple thanked him quietly, still tasting the faint sweetness of sherry from the previous evening on her lips. Back at Hartwell Manor that afternoon, Lady Hartwell gathered several villagers for tea. The drawing room smelled of roasting meat from the kitchen and fresh coal smoke from the newly stoked fire. Conversation turned inevitably to Thorn. Motives surfaced in careful phrases. The colonel needed funds and had quarreled over the watch's value. Eliza would inherit the business and premises. Tom stood to gain tools and perhaps more if parentage were acknowledged. Dr. Mortimer had argued fiercely with Thorn over a past misdiagnosis. That cost a patient dearly. Wind rattled the leaded windows. Miss Marple cradled her warm teacup. Feeling its heat against chilled fingers, a mantel clock chimed the hour, its clear notes echoing through the house. Someone mentioned a broken latch on the shop's back window. Perhaps a burglary gone wrong. Miss Marple examined it later. The latch was indeed loose, but dust lay thick and undisturbed around the frame. No entry had occurred there. As dusk gathered, she walked slowly back through the square. Gravel crunched once more beneath her shoes. The smell of approaching rain grew stronger, dampening the wool of her scarf. Street lamps flickered on, their soft glow catching in small puddles. She thought again of the hidden letters and the missing poison vial. The discovery of Thorn's secret paternity had raised the stakes considerably. More than money or professional pride was tangled in this quiet village tragedy. Chapter 3. Unwound Springs. The village hall had been hastily prepared for statements. A long table stood in the center, its surface gleaming with fresh furniture polish. The coal stove in the corner gave uneven heat, so the room smelled of coal smoke and lingering damp wool from the coats hung near the door. Sergeant Hale had summoned the principal suspects under the guise of formal depositions. Miss Marple took a quiet chair in the corner, her knitting needles clicking softly like a small clock. Colonel Ashby spoke first, sitting ramrod straight. "I called at the shop just after 2 o'clock to collect my chronometer," he declared in his confident upper-class tone. Thorn said the balance spring still needed attention. "I left within 10 minutes. Mrs. Ashby, beside him, smoothed her silk gloves nervously. "We walked home together, but I did return briefly. I'd forgotten my parasol on the counter." Her voice faltered at the end. Tom Wilkins shifted on his hard chair, the rough wooden seat creaking. "I mended that spring myself the morning before," he stammered. "Master were pleased. Said I could have the afternoon off. I weren't there at 3. His grease-stained fingers twisted a cap in his lap. Eliza Thorne sat very still, her hands folded tightly. "I heard voices raised downstairs around 3, she whispered. "Something about money." Then it went quiet. Dr. Mortimer leaned forward, medical bag at his feet. "I examined Thorne only last month," he retorted sharply. "His heart was weak. Digitalis prescribed, which he rarely took. No poison came from my dispensary." The hall clock ticked steadily above them. Miss Marple noted how each person's breathing quickened when their turn came. She began asking gentle questions. The colonel protested when she mentioned his bridge game at the club. "Witnesses say you left early," she observed quietly. Mrs. Ashby gasped. One hesitates to contradict one's husband, but perhaps the time was misremembered. Tom's alibi wavered. He admitted stopping by the shop briefly after the pub to fetch a forgotten tool. Eliza confessed she had gone down once more around 3:30, but found the shop dark. The questioning stretched for nearly an hour. Tensions rose with every small contradiction. The air grew warmer from the stove, yet hands remained cold. Sergeant Hale poured tea from a large pot. Its bitter steam rose in curls. Miss Marple sipped slowly, feeling the dry chalk taste it left behind. When the group dispersed briefly, Miss Marple slipped back to the watchmaker's shop with Hale's permission. The workbench waited under a single lamp. She ran her fingers along the rough wood edges until she located the hidden compartment again. Inside lay Thorne's private ledger. The pages crackled as she turned them. Several entries recorded irregular payments labeled only with initials. DM stood out repeatedly. A folded note tucked between pages mentioned the old surgery error, and continued discretion required. The smell of old ink mixed with faint lavender from a sachet nearby. She also found a small envelope containing a single lock of fair hair tied with thread. Tom's coloring. A pencil date on the back matched Tom's birth year. Outside, rain began to patter on the slate roof, its steady rhythm blending with a dying fire's crackle in the grate. Miss Marple touched the cold metal casing of Thorne's own watch. Frost still clung to the window above the bench. Back in the hall, Hale announced the preliminary autopsy result in a low voice. Cyanide traces confirmed, not natural causes. Gasps rippled through the room. Eliza snapped. But who could have got such a thing? Miss Marple remained silent, though her mind turned over the almond-like scent she had noticed on the body. She noticed the watch chain in the evidence tray. Fine gold links, one slightly bent as though forced apart recently, with faint white powder caught in the join. Such residue might come from crushed tablets ground in a pestle, or perhaps from handling medicine vials. The bend suggested deliberate tampering, not ordinary wear. It reminded her of Mrs. Langtry in St. Mary Mead, whose necklace chain had been pried open to conceal a few grains of laudanum during the day poisoning. When the rector's wife collapsed after communion, that bent link and powder residue proved Mrs. Langtry's guilt. She had laced the wine to silence questions about church fund embezzlement. The sexton, wrongly suspected because of his access to the chalice, was cleared by the chain's evidence. So whose chain carried this telltale powder? And why had it been left with the body? As the gray afternoon light faded, Miss Marple sat alone for a moment in the hall. The fire had sunk to embers. She reflected on the frozen hands of the watch and the way human secrets wound themselves tighter with every passing year. Greed and fear, she thought, were like overwhelmed mainsprings. They held for a time, then snapped with sudden violence, injuring everyone nearby. In St. Mary Mead, there had been old Mr. Hargreaves, the clock repairer, who uncovered his partner's forgery of antique timepieces. The partner, Mr. Ellis, desperate to keep the deception hidden, slipped arsenic into Hargreaves' evening tea during a late repair. The village assumed suicide from mounting debts. But Miss Marple noticed the mantel clock in the shop had been stopped at an impossible hour, deliberately altered to mislead the time of death. Ellis had solid alibis for the real hour, but none for the falsified one. Confronted, he broke and admitted everything. Envy of Hargreaves' superior skill had driven him. The business passed to an honest nephew afterward. The pattern was clear. Hidden shame and financial pressure turned ordinary people into something colder. In Clockford, the same forces appeared at work. Blackmail, debt, concealed parentage, yet perhaps something gentler lay beneath. A wish to protect. Gone tragically wrong. Human nature, she mused, clings to its secrets until the mechanism can bear no more. Then the spring uncoils, and truth spills out. Painful, but necessary. Chapter 4. Fractured Mechanisms. Miss Marple began the day with a visit to Ashby Manor. The Bentley's tires crunched over the gravel drive, and a sharp wind carried the scent of damp leaves and distant coal smoke. Inside the drawing room, the fire crackled steadily, yet the high windows let in enough frost to make breath faintly visible. Colonel Ashby stood by the mantel, his military bearing rigid. That chronometer was worth a small fortune, he declared brusquely. Thorne deliberately undervalued it to keep it longer, perhaps to sell it quietly himself. Miss Marple noted the smooth carved wood of the mantelpiece under her gloved fingers as she listened. She moved next to the walled garden where Mrs. Ashby waited among leafless rose bushes. The air smelled strongly of wet earth after overnight rain. Mrs. Ashby's silk scarf fluttered as she spoke in a nervous murmur. I did argue with Mr. Thorne about the repair charge, quite sharply, I'm afraid, but I left before anything. Untoward, a sudden gust rattled the garden gate. Its iron latch clanged coldly. She added quickly that a favorite brooch had gone missing the same week, perhaps stolen during the visit. Miss Marple examined the woman's smooth kid gloves and said nothing. At Dr. Mortimer's surgery, the waiting room carried the clean bite of antiseptic overlaid with faint pipe tobacco. The leather chair creaked as Miss Marple sat. The doctor met her briskly. My prussic acid vial vanished weeks ago, he retorted. Anyone could have taken it from the dispensary cupboard. My key is not always on my person. He tapped his bag. Its worn leather cool to the touch. Yet when pressed about his movements on the fatal afternoon, he snapped that a neighbor had seen him walking home much later than he claimed. The contradiction hung in the air like the chill from the unlit grate. Miss Marple walked on to Eliza Thorne's parlor above the shop. Lavender sachets scented the small room heavily. Almost cloyingly, Eliza sat with hands clasped tightly. I found threatening notes in his desk, she stammered, unsigned, but clearly from Tom, demanding money or he would expose something. She produced scraps of paper. The handwriting, however, slanted differently from Tom's careful schoolboy script. Miss Marple touched the scratchy velvet curtain beside her chair. The mantel clock ticked with a slightly uneven rhythm, as though one will have slipped. She called next at Tom Wilkins' modest cottage on the edge of the village. Rough stone walls met her hand with cold immediacy as she stepped inside. A small fire popped in the grate, sending coal smoke curling upward. Tom protested vehemently. "I never wrote no threats, miss. That's Master Thorne's own hand. I'd know it anywhere." He showed her a sample from an old receipt. The similarity was unmistakable. A small brown bottle had been discovered tucked behind the coal scuttle, labeled poison in shaky letters. But when opened, it held only dark ink. Another false trail. Sergeant Hale met her back at the shop with fresh information. A villager claimed to have seen a cloaked figure lurking near the back alley on the night before the death. Footsteps had echoed on the cobbles, then faded. Miss Marple examined the rear window latch again. It hung loose, bent at an odd angle, yet the surrounding dust remained perfect. No hand had disturbed it recently. The supposed burglary was another misdirection. Tension mounted through the afternoon. She returned to Hartwell Manor for a hurried tea with Lady Hartwell. The drawing room smelled of warm scones and fresh brewing tea, its bitter edge cutting through the sweetness. As villagers drifted in and out, alibis began to fracture openly. The Colonel's bridge partners could not recall him arriving until well after 4. Mrs. Ashby's parasol story wavered when the shop's counter was searched. No parasol had been left behind. Eliza admitted she had lied about staying upstairs the whole time. She had slipped down to check on her brother once more. Tom's half-day off had ended with him seen near the pub. Yet no one could confirm exactly when he left. Dr. Mortimer's surgery logs showed no house calls after 2 o'clock, contradicting his earlier statement. Wind howled against the manor windows, rattling panes and sending drafts across the floor. Miss Marple felt the cold metal of a sugar spoon against her palm as she stirred her cup. The taste of metallic anise coated her tongue. In the final quiet hour before dusk, she sat alone in the manor library. Rows of leather-bound books gave off a faint musty scent. The fire crackled low, casting long shadows across the rug. She turned over each contradiction in her mind. Forged notes, missing poison, bent latches, conflicting times. Every piece seemed designed to point away from the center. The mechanism of the crime was fracturing under its own weight, and soon the first true cog would slip free. Chapter 5. Broken hands. The village hall felt smaller that afternoon, with all the principal figures seated round the long polished table. Sergeant Hale had closed the doors against curious passers-by. The coal stove hissed softly, sending out waves of warmth that battled the persistent chill from the stone walls. Miss Marple sat at one end, her knitting laid aside for once. The air carried the mingled smells of furniture polish, damp wool from outdoor coats, and the faint bitter steam rising from a fresh pot of tea. Colonel Ashby spoke first, his voice sharp with indignation. "This suggestion of blackmail is preposterous. Thorne had no hold over me whatsoever." Yet when Miss Marple produced the small packet of letters from the hidden compartment, the Colonel's color rose. One note referred plainly to gambling debts secured against the family chronometer. "I intended to pay," he protested. The watch was to be sold quietly once repaired. Mrs. Ashby twisted her silk handkerchief. "We were in difficulties," she murmured. "One hesitates to admit such things." But the repair delay made everything worse. Her gloved hands trembled slightly as she accepted a cup of tea. The liquid's heat did little to warm the icy fear in her eyes. Tom Wilkins sat hunched, his rough fingers drumming nervously on the table. "I knew about some letters," he stammered. "Master showed me once. Said they were private business. I never asked for money." Eliza Thorne's voice was barely above a whisper. He spoke of telling Tom the truth about being his father. I begged him not to. It would have broken everything. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked relentlessly, each swing of the pendulum seeming to tighten the room's tension. Dr. Mortimer leaned forward, his medical bag resting against his chair like a silent witness. "My past mistake was years ago," he snapped. "A surgical error covered up. Thorne demanded monthly payments to keep silent. I paid, until I could pay no more." Miss Marple spoke gently but firmly. She lifted the gold watch chain from the evidence tray. This link was bent deliberately. Traces of white powder remain in the join. Residue from digitalis tablets. Crushed fine. Gasps circled the table. The doctor's face strained of color. Digitalis was prescribed for his heart. He protested. He might have taken too much himself, but the dosage in his system was fatal. Miss Marple observed. And the watch. Its hand stopped at 3 o'clock by a slender silver pin jammed into the mechanism. She placed the pin beside the chain. Its bright length gleamed under the lamp. A surgical pin, doctor, of the type kept in your bag for securing dressings or probing small wounds. The room fell quiet save for the fire's crackle and the uneven breathing of those present. Wind moaned outside, rattling the windows in their leaded frames. Miss Marple continued quietly. You called on Thorne that afternoon under pretext of a routine check. You prepared his tea yourself, as you had done before. The digitalis, increased beyond safety, was stirred in. The watch was stopped to suggest death had occurred later, giving you time to leave and establish an alibi elsewhere. Dr. Mortimer's hands shook visibly. I only meant to weaken him, make him ill enough to stop the demands for a while. His voice cracked. The amount. I misjudged. He buried his face in his hands for a moment, then looked up, defeated. I never intended murder. After the others were asked to wait in an adjoining room, Miss Marple remained with Hale in the now empty hall. She moved to the workbench evidence, running her fingers along the rough wooden surface once more. The oily scent of watch parts lingered, mixed with the lavender sachet still tucked in a drawer. In a small side compartment, she found Thorne's final entry, a penciled note dated the day before his death. Shall tell the boy tomorrow. No more hiding. The paper crackled faintly as she refolded it. Rain began again, tapping steadily on the roof. She touched the cold metal frame of the window, feeling frost still clinging to the inside pane. Lady Hartwell appeared at the door, murmuring concern. Is it over, Jane? Miss Marple nodded slowly. The truth had begun to uncoil. The final confirmation came when she tested the stopwatch in better light. The pen, extracted carefully, bore a minute scratch matching the pattern on Dr. Mortimer's surgical instruments tray, visible when Hale brought the bag for comparison. Sounds of the village carried faintly through the walls. Footsteps on wet gravel. A distant door creaking shut. In a small side office, Dr. Mortimer faced them alone. His confident manner had shattered completely. It was desperation. He whispered hoarsely. The payments were ruining me. I thought illness would silence him long enough to rearrange my affairs. Tears stood in his eyes. I see now there is no rearranging what I have done. Miss Marple regarded him with quiet sorrow. The metallic taste of tragedy lingered in her mouth, sharper than any tea. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing the streets clean, or trying to. She noticed the pen once more, slender, silver, its tip bent from being forced into the watch's delicate gears, bearing the same fine scratch pattern found on instruments handled repeatedly in surgery. Such a mark came not from watchmaking, but from precise medical work. Probing, securing, adjusting under pressure. It reminded her of Nurse Hopkins in St. Mary Mead during the Enderby poisoning affair. The nurse had used similar surgical pens to tamper with the wool by pricking the ink and altering dates on a deathbed document. When old Mrs. Enderby died, those tiny holes and the bent pin in the nurse's kit proved her guilt. She had forged the new will to steal inherited jewelry. The parlor maid, suspected because of her access to the inkstand, was cleared by the pen's distinctive scratches. So this pen, left behind in haste, marked the doctor's hand unmistakably. In that moment, Dr. Mortimer's mask of professional calm broke entirely. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time the healer became the one in need of healing. Chapter 6. Revealed Cogs. Eliza Thorne sat in her small upstairs parlor, the lavender sachets giving the room an almost suffocating sweetness. The fire in the grate had been freshly stoked. Its crackle provided the only warmth against the persistent autumn chill. Rain tapped steadily on the slate roof above. Miss Marple settled opposite her on the scratchy horsehair sofa, woolen gloves still on against the cold metal of the teapot handle. Eliza spoke first, her voice low and unsteady. Elias never wanted anyone to know how we began. In London, years ago, he apprenticed with a jeweler who dealt in fine timepieces, but business was poor. He forged a few antique watches, small things at first, just to keep the shop afloat. She paused, fingers twisting the edge of her shawl. When the forgeries were discovered, he fled north, changed his name slightly, and settled here in Clockford. He swore it was behind him. Miss Marple nodded gently. The mantel clock ticked with a measured rhythm, as though counting out old sins. Eliza continued, but old habits lingered. He began repairing pieces for wealthy clients, and sometimes he learned things, secrets, debts, mistakes. He kept records, quiet payments for silence. The smell of damp wool rose from Eliza's shawl as she drew it tighter. Dr. Mortimer's payment was the largest. An operation gone wrong 20 years back. A patient died. Mortimer hushed it with money and influence. Elias took his share every month. Tom Wilkins appeared at the door, cap in hand, raindrops glistening on his rough coat. Miss Eliza asked me to come, he stammered. She said it were time I knew. Eliza looked at him with something close to pity. Your mother worked in service in London. Elias was young, foolish. When she died in childbirth, he paid a family to raise you. He never told you because he thought it kinder. But lately, he changed his mind. He meant to make it right. She produced a small bundle of papers from a drawer. The yellow sheets crackled as she unfolded them. A birth certificate in faded ink. A brief letter from a midwife. Receipts for monthly support. Tom stared at the documents, rough hands trembling. All these years, he whispered. He let me think I were nobody. Miss Marple touched the smooth wood of the table beside her. The blackmail was not only for money, she observed quietly. It was also control. Keeping secrets gave him power over others, and over his own guilt. Later that evening, the suspects gathered once more in Hartwell Manor's drawing room at Sergeant Hale's request. The fire burned brightly now, chasing frost from the window panes. Footsteps echoed on the polished floor as each person entered. Colonel Ashby and his wife sat stiffly. Eliza stood near the mantel. Tom remained by the door. Dr. Mortimer arrived last, bag in hand, face gray. Miss Marple spoke without preamble. M.R. Thorne's death was no accident of the heart. Digitalis, your own prescription. Doctor, was administered in overdose. Stirred into his tea during your visit that afternoon. She lifted the bent gold chain from the tray. Powder residue here matches crushed tablets from your dispensary. The watch was stopped with this surgical pin. She placed it beside the chain to mislead the time of death. Mortimer's shoulders sagged. The room was silent save for the fire's soft pops and the wind outside. He spoke at last, voice hoarse. I never meant to kill him. The payments had drained me. I thought if he became ill, seriously ill, he would stop pressing for more. I increased the dose in his cup. When he collapsed, I panicked. I jammed the watch to suggest he died later. After I had left for a house call, he looked round at the others. The almond scent. That was his pipe tobacco, a special blend he kept for evenings. It mimicked cyanide on the breath. A long breath escaped him. I left the glove behind in my haste. The pin too. Foolish mistakes. Hell stepped forward quietly. You'll come with me now, Doctor. Mortimer nodded without protest. As they moved toward the door, Miss Marple remained seated, watching the group. The smell of coal smoke mingled with the faint sweetness of sherry someone had poured earlier. Its taste lingered dry and metallic on her tongue. Alone later in her room at the manor, Miss Marple sat by the small fire. The wind howled softly beyond the curtains. She reflected on the day's revelations. The way past actions coiled around the present like watch springs wound too tight. It brought to mind the case of Mr. Fortescue in St. Mary Mead, a respectable banker who lent money at ruinous interest and then blackmailed borrowers to ensure repayment. When his young clerk, Reeves, discovered the ledgers and threatened exposure, Fortescue tried to silence him with doctored medicine, sleeping draughts laced with something stronger. The village assumed heart failure, but Miss Marple noticed the bottle cap had been resealed clumsily, and the ledger page bore a telltale smudge from Fortescue's own thumb. Reeves fought back in panic. Fortescue took his own fatal dose by mistake. Mrs. Fortescue, protecting her husband's lover, had supplied the altered bottle. In the end, Reeves was cleared, and the bank passed to honest hands. Greed had twisted the banker's life into a mechanism of destruction. Much as Thorne's secrets had ensnared Mortimer, the pattern was sadly familiar. Hidden shame and financial desperation turned protectors into predators, healers into poisoners. Yet the human heart, even when broken, could sometimes be rewound toward truth. In Clockford, the spring had finally snapped. What remained was the slow work of mending, or letting the pieces lie as they fell. On the mantel, the heirloom chronometer, now cleaned and repaired, ticked forward once more. Its steady rhythm filled the quiet room like a promise that time, at least, could be set right again. Chapter 7. Assembled pieces. The drawing room at Hartwell Manor had been arranged with deliberate care that evening. Chairs formed a loose circle around the low table, where a single lamp burned steadily. The fire in the grate crackled with fresh logs, sending warmth against the frost that still clung to the window panes. The air carried the familiar sense of beeswax polish from the furniture, faint pipe tobacco lingering on Colonel Ashby's coat, and the clean coal smoke rising from the chimney. Lady Hartwell had withdrawn to the library, leaving the space to Sergeant Hale and Miss Marple. The suspects entered one by one. Gravel crunched outside as cars arrived. Footsteps echoed across the polished hall floor. Colonel Ashby took the armchair nearest the fire, his military posture unbroken. Mrs. Ashby sat beside him, silk dress rustling softly. Eliza Thorne chose a small upright chair, hands folded tightly in her lap. Tom Wilkins hesitated at the door before stepping in, cap already removed and twisted in rough fingers. Dr. Mortimer came last, walking slowly, his medical bag left behind in the hall for the first time. Miss Marple waited until all were seated. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with a calm, measured beat. She began quietly, her voice carrying clearly over the fire's soft pops. Immerse. Thorne's death was caused by an overdose of digitalis, she said. Not the cyanide first suspected. The almond scent came from his special pipe tobacco blend. Digitalis was his prescribed medicine doctor, but the amount in his system far exceeded safety. She lifted the small evidence tray from the table. The bent gold watch chain gleamed under the lamplight. Powder residue caught here matches crushed tablets from your dispensary. You stirred them into his tea during your visit that afternoon. Mortimer stared at the chain without speaking. His hands rested on his knees, no longer steady. Miss Marple continued. The watch itself was stopped at 3 o'clock by this surgical pin. She placed the slender silver length beside the chain. A pin from your own instrument case, scratched in the distinctive pattern that comes from repeated use in delicate procedures. You jammed it into the mechanism to suggest death occurred later, after you had supposedly left for another call. The colonel shifted in his chair. Then the blackmail letters were genuine, Miss Marple said gently. M.R. Thorne kept records of payments received. Yours, Colonel. For the undervalued chronometer sale, he arranged quietly to cover your debts. Mrs. Ashby's visits were not only about repairs. She too knew of the arrangement. Mrs. Ashby's gloved hand tightened on her handkerchief. Eliza spoke in a low voice. He intended to tell Tom the truth about his parentage. I feared it would destroy the business, our livelihood. Tom looked up sharply. He never said a word to me. Miss Marple turned to the doctor. Your opportunity was clearest. You arrived shortly after 2. Under pretext of checking his heart, you prepared the tea yourself, as you had done on previous visits. The increased dose was meant to weaken him, perhaps hospitalize him, long enough to halt the monthly demands that were bankrupting you. But the amount proved fatal. In panic, you stopped the watch, left the glove beneath the bench, and hurried away. Mortimer's shoulders slumped. The firelight caught the sudden sheen of sweat on his brow. I told myself it was only to make him ill, he whispered, enough to stop the letters. I never calculated. I never meant. His voice broke. The pen, I thought it would be lost among his tools. The glove, I dropped it in haste. Sergeant Hale stepped forward from the shadows near the door. Dr. Mortimer, I must ask you to accompany me. The doctor rose slowly. No one moved to stop him. Footsteps sounded again in the hall as Hale guided him out. The front door closed with a soft, final click. Silence settled over the room. The clock continued its steady tick. Miss Marple looked round at the remaining faces. The broken latch on the shop window, she said, was merely wind damage, nothing taken, dust undisturbed. The threatening notes found by Eliza were in Thorne's own hand. He wrote them as insurance, perhaps to suggest burglary if questions arose. The stranger seen in the alley was the delivery boy from the station, late with a parcel. Colonel Ashby cleared his throat. One hesitates to say it, but justice has been done. Mrs. Ashby murmured agreement, though her eyes remained downcast. Eliza touched Tom's arm briefly. A small, tentative gesture. Tom nodded. Rough hands still. Miss Marple lifted the ledger page from the tray. A faint ink smudge marred the margin, shaped like a thumbprint, with a distinctive swirl pattern that came from repeated pressure signing prescriptions or handling medical charts. This mark, she observed quietly, matches those on your daily log, Doctor. It confirms you handled Thorne's private records during one of your visits, perhaps searching for the incriminating pages. The smudge had been almost invisible until held to the light. Now it stood out plainly. She noticed the thumbprint once more, clear in the lamplight. Its whorls precise and professional, quite unlike Thorne's work-hardened pads. Such a print belonged to smooth, frequently washed hands accustomed to ink and paper in careful notation. It reminded her of Apothecary Jenkins in St. Mary Mead during the Poison Pen affair. Jenkins had forged anonymous letters to drive away a rival herbalist. His ledgers bore identical thumb smudges where he pressed too hard while copying threats. When the rector received the final note, those marks proved Jenkins' guilt. The ink matched his dispensary bottle exactly. The postman, wrongly suspected for his daily handling of mail, was cleared by the print's unique pattern. So this smudge, left carelessly on Thorne's page, tied the doctor to the secrets he had tried to bury. In the quiet that followed, an emotional truth settled over the room like the warmth from the dying fire. Even those who mend bodies can break under the weight of their own hidden burdens. When cornered by shame, the hand that heals may reach for poison instead. The circle of chairs slowly emptied. Miss Marple remained seated a moment longer, watching the flames flicker lower. Outside, wind sighed through the bare branches, carrying the faint sound of a distant church bell marking the hour. Chapter 8. Shattered Dial. The arrest took place with quiet efficiency on the gravel drive outside Hartwell Manor. Sergeant Hale had waited until Dr. Mortimer stepped from the front door, coat buttoned against the evening frost. 2 constables flanked him. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked shut around the doctor's wrists with a sound sharp enough to carry on the still air. Gravel crunched under their boots as they guided him toward the waiting police car. Mortimer did not resist. He only murmured once, almost to himself, "I accept whatever comes now." The car's engine started with a low rumble. Tail lights faded down the lane like dying embers. Wind sighed through the bare trees, carrying the faint coal smoke from the manor chimneys. Inside the drawing room, the remaining group gathered in stunned silence. The fire still burned brightly, its crackle the only sound for several long moments. Lady Hartwell had returned from the library and stood near the mantel, one hand resting on the smooth polished wood. Colonel Ashby cleared his throat first. "Justice has been served," he declared, though his usual confidence sounded thinner. One hesitates to speak ill of the man after such an end. But the facts are plain. Mrs. Ashby sat very straight, silk dress rustling faintly as she shifted. She pressed a gloved hand to her throat where pearls lay cool against her skin. "He was our doctor," she whispered. "We trusted him with so much." Tears stood in her eyes, quickly blinked away. The metallic taste of shock lingered in the room, sharper than the bitter tea that had gone cold on the side table. Tom Wilkins remained near the door, cap forgotten in his rough hands. "I never thought not him," he stammered. "He patched me up when I cut my hand on the lathe last spring. Seemed kind." His voice cracked on the last word. Eliza Thorne sat apart, staring into the flames. "My brother kept secrets from everyone," she said softly, "but I never imagined they would end like this." Her fingers traced the scratchy fabric of her sleeve, seeking comfort in the familiar texture. Miss Marple moved quietly among them, offering no platitudes. She noted the way each person's breathing had changed, shallower, uneven. As the weight of revelation settled, the grandfather clock ticked on, its pendulum swinging with mechanical calm. Outside, distant footsteps sounded on the village paths as word began to spread. By the next morning, the news had reached every corner of Clockford. In the pub, wooden beams low overhead, pipe tobacco smoke hung thick while men clustered round the bar. Mr. Croft, the baker, spoke in his measured middle-class tone. "Shocking business. Dr. Mortimer, of all people. I always thought him above reproach." A working-class laborer nearby snapped. "Thought you were better than us, didn't he? Turns out you were worse." Glasses clinked. The fire popped in the grate. The smell of ale mingled with damp wool from coats hung to dry. At the post office, Mrs. Finley stamped letters with brisk movements. "I seen him walking past yesterday afternoon," she told a customer. "Looked right drawn." "He did. Now we know why." The wall clock ticked above the counter. A cold draft slipped under the door, bringing the scent of rain-soaked earth. In the village square, small groups formed and dispersed. Reverend Blackwell stood outside the church, cassock brushing the stone path. "We must pray for all concerned," he observed gently. "The doctor most of all. No soul is beyond redemption." Yet his voice held a note of sorrow that echoed in the listeners. Footsteps crunched on gravel as people moved on, conversations dropping to murmurs. The shop itself stood quiet for the first time in years, its windows dark. The sign still reading E. Thorne, watchmaker and repairer. Inside, tools lay where they had fallen. The oily scent of mechanisms now overlaid with the faint lavender from Eliza's sachets upstairs. Tom had already visited, touching the workbench with careful fingers. "I'll open again soon," he told a passerby. Honest work from now on. His rough hands, once stained only with grease, now carried the weight of sudden responsibility. Eliza had packed a small case. She planned to leave Clockford for a sister in York. Distance, she said, to let grief settle. "The house above the shop holds too many echoes," she confessed to Lady Hartwell over tea. The cup warmed her chilled fingers. The sweet sherry left a lingering warmth on her tongue. The Ashbys drove home in silence. Colonel Ashby's knuckles showed white on the steering wheel. "We'll sell the chronometer properly now," he said at last. "No more secrets." Mrs. Ashby nodded, her silk scarf smoothed against her neck. Debts would be paid. The manor would stand as before, but lighter somehow. Lady Hartwell hosted a small gathering that evening. Nothing formal, only tea and quiet talk. The drawing room smelled of fresh baking and coal smoke. Conversations turned to mending what could be mended. "Clockford has seen worse storms," she murmured. "We shall come through this one." Miss Marple sat by the window, watching dusk deepen over the square. The village clocks began to chime the hour, one after another, their notes overlapping in gentle discord before finding harmony. The sound echoed the morning of discovery. Yet now the silence in the watchmaker's shop felt less ominous, more expectant. Dr. Mortimer's fate diverged sharply. He would face trial in the county court. The charge manslaughter rather than murder. Given the absence of premeditated intent, his practice would close. Patients transferred to a doctor from the next town. Yet in the quiet moments before sleep, some villagers would remember his steady hands during fevers and broken bones, and wonder how such skill could turn so fatally inward. The community reaction, first shock, then whispered outrage, slowly softened into something closer to sorrow. Faces that had been blind to hidden strains now looked at neighbors with new understanding. The shop, once sinister in its stillness, waited for Tom's return. Tools polished, fire relit, ready for honest ticking once more. In the manor drawing room, Miss Marple rose at last. She touched the cold metal fob of her own small watch, feeling its steady pulse against her palm. The day's events mirrored, in reverse, the moment she had first entered the silent shop. Chaos giving way to order, darkness yielding to dawn. Chapter 9. Mended Works. The official resolution came the following morning in the village hall. Sergeant Hale stood at the head of the long table, papers spread before him under the steady light of the overhead lamp. The room still smelled faintly of furniture polish from the previous day's hurried cleaning, mixed now with the damp wool scent of coats carried in from the morning mist. A small fire burned in the grate, its crackle providing a gentle counterpoint to the solemn occasion. Hale cleared his throat. "Dr. Mortimer has made a full statement," he announced in his measured middle-class voice. "The charge is manslaughter, death by unlawful administration of a noxious substance, without premeditated intent to kill. He will appear before the magistrates next week and likely be committed for trial at the assizes. The case is closed as far as Clockford is concerned." He folded the papers with deliberate care. Any further questions should be directed to the Crown's office. Miss Marple sat quietly near the back, hands folded over her knitting bag. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked on, its sound now seeming less accusatory than it had on the day of discovery. Outside, footsteps crunched on the gravel path as villagers lingered, waiting for news to filter through. Tom Wilkins was the first to show visible change. He arrived at the watchmaker's shop shortly after noon, key in hand. The door creaked open. Inside, the air carried the familiar oily scent of mechanisms and the faint lavender from upstairs sachets. He moved slowly along the workbench, touching each tool with careful fingers. Rough, grease-stained hands that now held authority. "I'll keep the name as it is," he told a small cluster of neighbors who had followed him in. "Thorne and Son. Honest work from now on. No secrets." His voice, once stammering, carried a new steadiness. The fire he lit in the small stove crackled warmly, chasing frost from the window panes. The shop, once sinister in its stillness, began to feel like a place of purpose again. Eliza Thorne stood at the upstairs window, watching. Her small case rested by the door. She would leave for York by the evening train. Yet something had shifted in her posture. Shoulders less hunched, hands no longer twisting constantly. She had read her brother's final note the night before. A brief, penciled message tucked in the ledger. "Forgive me, Eliza. The boy deserves the truth. The business is his if he wants it." Tears had come then, but with them a measure of release. "I can start again," she murmured to Miss Marple over her last cup of tea in the parlor. "No more hiding what isn't mine to hide." The sweet cherry they shared left a gentle warmth on her tongue, easing the chalk-dry grief that had lingered for days. At Ashby Manor, the Colonel and his wife sat in the drawing room, the heirloom chronometer resting on the mantel between them. Its gold case gleamed in the firelight. The hands moved forward steadily now. No pen to jam the works. Colonel Ashby spoke quietly. "We'll sell it through a proper London house. Debts cleared. No more corners cut." Mrs. Ashby nodded, her silk gloves smooth as she touched the watch's face. One hesitates to say it, but perhaps this has taught us something. Their voices, once sharp with defensiveness, carried a subdued calm. The room felt lighter, the scratchy fabric of the chairs less confining. Reverend Blackwell called on several households that afternoon. In the pub, men listened as he observed gently. "We have all been blind in our way, seeing only the surface, never the strain beneath." Working-class voices murmured agreement. Middle-class ones nodded thoughtfully. The community, shocked into silence the day before, now spoke in quieter, kinder tones. Faces turned toward neighbors with new recognition. The baker who had never asked after Thorne's health, the postmistress who had noticed his agitation but said nothing. Understanding spread slowly, like warmth from a newly lit stove. Loose ends tied themselves with small, practical actions. The broken window latch was repaired, cold metal now secure. No longer a red herring. The threatening notes, proved to be Thorne's own invention, were burned in the manor grate. Their ashes mingled with coal smoke and drifted up the chimney. Alibis, once tangled, had been verified by Hale's quiet checks. The Colonel's early departure from the club, Mrs. Ashby's brief return to the shop, Tom's half-hour near the pub, all accounted for. None damning. Miss Marple walked through the square in the late afternoon. Gravel crunched under her shoes. Wind carried the scent of rain-washed earth and baking bread from the shop next door. She paused outside the watchmaker's window, watching Tom polish a small mantel clock with careful strokes. The future stretched ahead. Tom's marriage to a local girl planned for spring. Eliza's journey promising new horizons. The Ashby's household steadier without the weight of hidden debts. Clockford would not forget, but it would heal. She noticed the chronometer in the window display, its mainspring now perfectly coiled, tension released, hands moving in smooth unison. No trace remained of the bend that had once symbolized forced secrets and desperate acts. Such repair required patience. Dismantling, cleaning, reassembling with steady hands. It reminded her of Widow Barnes and St. Mary Mead, whose broken locket spring had concealed a love letter during the village theft ring. When Jules vanished from the manor, that tiny spring, mended in secret by the butler, proved his innocence. He had fixed it for her as a kindness, not a crime. The guilty gardener's sticky fingers were exposed by other marks entirely. So this chronometer, mended and placed on open view, signaled hope. Wounds could close, mechanisms could tick true again, with truth aired and justice begun. Clockford looked forward, not to a return of the old silence, but to a quieter, more honest rhythm. Chapter 10. Eternal Ticking. Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead on a crisp January afternoon in 1963. The train pulled into the familiar station with a gentle hiss of steam. She stepped down onto the platform, small suitcase in one gloved hand, knitting bag over her arm. The air carried the sharp scent of frost and coal smoke from the engine. Jenkins, the station porter, touched his cap and carried her case to the waiting trap. "Welcome home, miss," he said quietly. "Heard you sorted things out in Clockford proper." She smiled and thanked him. The horses' hooves clopped steadily on the frosty road as they drove past hedgerows edged with white. Her cottage welcomed her like an old friend. The fire had been laid by faithful Dolly. It crackled to life as soon as the match touched the kindling. The room smelled of beeswax polish, lavender from the sachets in the drawers, and the faint damp wool of her traveling coat hung to dry. She settled into her favorite chair, the worn leather smooth and comforting beneath her. A pot of tea steamed on the small table. Its warmth chased the last chill from her fingers. The mantel clock ticked contentedly, its pendulum swinging in perfect rhythm. Letters arrived over the next days, each one bringing news from Clockford. Tom Wilkins wrote first, his careful handwriting steadier now. He had married his sweetheart in a quiet ceremony at the church. The shop thrived under E. Thorne and Son. Honest repairs only. No secrets kept. Eliza sent a postcard from York. She had found lodgings near her sister, taken up embroidery classes, and spoke of peace she had not known in years. The Ashby's chronometer had sold at auction for a fair price. Debts cleared. They planned a small trip to the coast come spring. Lady Hartwell's note was warm and grateful. "The village breathes easier, Jane. We remember the lesson. Kindness uncovers more than suspicion ever could." Dr. Mortimer's trial had concluded swiftly. Manslaughter. 5 years imprisonment with possibility of earlier release for good conduct. Some villagers still spoke of him with bitterness. Others, remembering fevers eased and children delivered safely, wrote letters of support to the prison chaplain. Time would decide the rest. Miss Marple sat by the window one quiet evening, watching snowflakes drift past the leaded panes. They touched the glass with icy fingers, then melted into clear drops. The chronometer affair in Clockford lingered in her thoughts, turning over like a well-oiled gear. It echoed so closely the case of old Mr. Enderby in St. Mary Mead years before. A reclusive inventor who hid his modest fortune inside the mechanisms of antique watches. He had lent money quietly, then used knowledge of borrowers' troubles to extract interest in silence. When his nephew discovered the hidden compartments and threatened exposure, Enderby tried to silence him with a doctored tonic, sleeping draughts laced with something stronger. The village assumed heart failure from overwork. Clocks in the house had been stopped at misleading hours. Miss Marple had noticed the surgical pin jammed in one mechanism, the glove left behind with its distinctive wear from handling tools, and ledger smudges matching the nephew's thumb. The young man confessed in the end. Panic, not premeditation. The chronometer that had concealed the fortune was donated to the church as a memorial. Its steady ticking reminded the village that time revealed all. Eventually, in Clockford, the main symbol had transformed similarly. Thorne's prized gold chronometer, once stopped in deceit to hide the hour of death, now rested in the village museum case. Cleaned, repaired, hands moving forward without hesitation. What had been a tool of concealment became a quiet testament to truth uncovered. The bent link, the jammed pin, the powdered residue, all mended or removed. The watch no longer guarded secrets. It marked the passing of ordinary days, a reminder that mechanisms, like lives, could be set right with patience and honesty. Human nature, she reflected, wound its own traps with such care. Greed, shame, fear. These coiled the spring tighter year by year until it snapped, injuring the innocent along with the guilty. Yet the same nature held the capacity for uncoiling. Confession, forgiveness, new beginnings. In St. Mary Mead after Enderby, neighbors who had whispered suspicions now shared burdens openly. In Clockford, the same slow healing had begun. Class lines, upper restraint, middle caution, working grit, mattered less when secrets lay exposed. Everyone stood equal before time's impartial chime. Miss Marple had watched it all unfold. First as quiet observer noting gloves and stopped hands, then as investigator tracing threads of blackmail and poison, finally as moral witness to the aftermath. Each role had its place. Each taught the same gentle lesson. People were rarely wholly evil or wholly good. Only human, capable of terrible mistakes and quiet redemption. She set her knitting aside and poured another cup of tea. The steam rose warm against her face. The bruised slight bitterness softened with a spoonful of honey. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the garden in soft white. The cottage felt peaceful. The fires glowed steady on the walls. The clock on the mantel chimed the hour. Clear, unhurried notes that echoed through the small room. Miss Marple smiled faintly. In the quiet after the chime, only the gentle ticking remained. Time heals all wounds, but only when we have the courage to listen to its quiet warnings before the final spring breaks.